Some while ago, the Tyranids saw the release of a whole swathe of their bigger units in plastic. We received things like the Tyrant effects, the Trigon, the Exocrine, and the Hive Guard alongside their alternate build options. But many of the smaller units were missed. The Biovore was one of these missed models, and as a result, its miniature is quite old now and is only readily available in Finecast, but I'm hoping to fix that. I'm Pete the Wargamer, and in this video I'll be showing you how to build a plastic alternative to the Biovore. The most obvious starting point for this was the Tyrant/Hive Guard set. It features some stocky looking Tyranids that have the rough body shape of a Biovore, as well as some components that I could repurpose as a Spore Mine launcher. So I began by removing the components required to build a Tyrant Guard before cleaning them up with my knife. My first task in constructing this miniature was to recreate the Biovore's torso. Compared to the Tyrant Guard, it has a much more hunched appearance and holds its head lower down. In addition to this, it is also less heavily armoured. But before I could start with the modifications, I glued the legs to the tail section as per the instructions, as these wouldn't be requiring any changes just yet. To create a less armoured appearance, I began with the two halves of the torso and started to saw away the curved section of the carapace that would normally hang above the head. I started with just one half before comparing it to the second half to ensure that the cut would correctly line up once glued. I then proceeded to smooth out this rather rough cut, blending it back into the sweeping shape of the carapace. It was left with a hole at the front of the armour, but this didn't matter as I'll be covering this up later on. Now, doing these sorts of modifications before gluing meant that I didn't run the risk of tearing apart the bond as I made the necessary cuts and changes, and it's a generally good practice to follow with your own kit bashing. While I still had the torso in two separate halves, I took this opportunity to make room for the Spore Mine launcher to be situated on top of it. To create this weapon, I took the Hive Guard ranged weapon from the sprue. Not only was this a decent size for use in this conversion, but using it would also mean that I wouldn't need to source it from any other Tyranid kits, which would potentially increase the cost of the build. Now, at this stage in the build, I had planned to use the full length of the gun, which meant that I needed to remove the arm that it was attached to at first. In hindsight, this was unnecessary, as I ultimately decided to remove this rear section completely. But if you're following this guide yourself and would prefer a longer gun, then you will need to clip away the arm like I did here. Once I had clipped away the bulk of the arm, I took my knife and used it to carefully smooth out the area that it had been attached to. But regardless of how long the Spore Mine launcher was, I still needed to adjust the carapace to allow the gun to get a flush fit against it. I made a series of comparisons and found that the small eye-like point in the weapon should be positioned over the central armour segment. With the position chosen, I then made a series of cuts to the top of the carapace and the underside of the weapon. Frequent comparisons were made during this process to check exactly where the cuts needed to be made. Like before, I kept the two halves of the torso separated for this step 2, only gluing them together once I was happy with how the gun was lining up, but I didn't attach the gun just yet, as that would be done later on. Now that I had completed the bulk of the torso adjustments and I had glued the two halves of it together, I could finally see about recreating that slightly more hunched pose that the Biovores have. The problem I faced was that the ball and socket joint between the legs and the torso kind of forced a more upright position. So once again, I broke out the trusted scalpel and began making cuts. The first was to the underside of the torso. This was preventing me from creating a shallower angle between the front legs and the front of the torso, so this was flattened out accordingly. And like always, I made a series of comparisons and trims to ensure that the cuts were being made to the correct places and in the correct amounts. Another advantage of angling the torso slightly forwards was that this lower position now allowed me to use the Tyrant Guard's rending claw arms in the forwardmost socket in the torso, mimicking the forward arms of the original Biovore miniature. It was these arms that I used as a rough guide to ensure that I was gluing the torso at the correct angle. I temporarily attached them to the front arm sockets and ensured that the bottoms of the arms were in line with the feet as I glued the legs and the torso into place. Next, I needed to create the Spore Sacks that house the Biovore living ammunition. While there are other Tyranid kits that I could have turned to, Venom Thropes for example, the intended result was easy enough to produce with some green stuff. I cut away some of the blue and yellow halves, but left the points where they touched alone. This contact point can sometimes have already cured, which can result in your green stuff being lumpy or gritty when you start to mix it, so it's best to leave it alone. Once mixed, I rolled out the green stuff into small balls of roughly 2 to 3 millimeters in diameter. I made sure to use some Vaseline on my fingers and surfaces to prevent the green stuff from sticking, and once rolled out, I put these to one side until I had just over 20 of these made. Once the green stuff had been left to cure overnight, I could begin attaching the first half of these balls. These were attached to the underside of the torso towards the lower part of the abdomen. Using super glue, I arranged these in an uneven, but not necessarily symmetrical fashion, and assembled them in such a way that made them appear to be hanging down. Now at the moment, the sacks didn't really look like sacks, but just an arrangement of spheres, which I went on to fix with more green stuff. I cut and mixed some more putty and rolled this out into some small sausages. These were then pressed in and around the gaps between the balls before being blended out with my sculpting tool dipped in some more Vaseline. By filling in these gaps, I created more of a consistent surface, which resulted in more of a sack-filled writhing spores appearance. Once I had filled the gaps and added some sections of skin to the spore sacks, I left this green stuff to cure fully once more. With the green stuff beneath the torso cured, I brought in the Tyrant Guard arms and glued them into the frontmost sockets to complete the Biovore's pose. Next, I could return to the gun. It was at this stage that I decided to clip away the rear half of the cannon. I wanted to add a second sack, and the stock of this rifle would have gotten in the way. So I used my clippers to remove this rear section of the gun before smoothing out the cut again with my knife. Due to my earlier adjustments, the cannon was already sitting nicely against the carapace and just needed to be attached. To ensure that I had a good, strong bond, I broke out the pin vise and drilled a hole into the underside of the gun before drilling another hole into the associated point on the Biovore's carapace. I then superglued a section of 1mm thick steel fluorescent wire into the gun. I gave it a chance to dry before cutting the wire to length. I then superglued this protruding section of wire into the hole in the Biovore's carapace. By using a pinning technique here, I ensured that the bond was much stronger on this more prominent part of the model. The Hive Guard can either be equipped with an impaler cannon or a shock cannon, and it was the form of these that I chose to use to represent the Biovore's spore cannon. But before I could attach it to the rest of the weapon, I removed the pipe hanging down from one side. This was no longer needed and wouldn't fit either, so it was simply clipped away. Once clipped, I cleaned up the cut with my knife, glued together the two halves of the cannon, and then attached it to the carapace mounted weapon. At this point, I had my cannon, but it looked tacked on and didn't have that organic, grown for a purpose look that the original Biovore and other Tyranid units have. To help blend this new addition into the rest of the model, I began with some armor plates. These were also found within the Tyrant Guard kit, and they were just large enough to cover and completely encompass part of the weapon just behind the main barrel. I glued these into place without needing to make any adjustments to them. I then used the smaller armor plate from the kit to cover over the hole at the front of the carapace. My final step in building the weapon was to add yet another spore mine sack to the rear of the cannon. Like before, I started by gluing on the cured green stuff spheres, clustering them around the base of the cannon. Once they had all been glued into place, I mixed up a fresh batch of green stuff and filled in all those gaps just like I did before. While I had still had some green stuff mixed, I used this to fill in some of the gaps between the extra armor plates that I had added around the weapon. This final touch helped to finish off the organic aspect of the weapon that I was looking to reproduce. The final steps were much more straightforward. I was still missing the head, and the central arm sockets were also empty. For the arms, I wanted something small and diminutive compared to the rest of the model, almost like a vestigial arm. The Biovore kit didn't come with anything small enough for this, so I dipped into one of my bits boxes and found myself a pair of rending claws from the Gene Stealer sprue. These were the only non-Tyrant Guard components that I'd used here, but chances are that if you're a Tyranid player, you're already likely to have some sort of small arm that you could use here instead. These arms were glued into the empty sockets with no adjustment needed. Finally, I just needed a head, and the Tyrant Guard kit was, once again, perfect for my needs. I glued this into place, and that concluded the build. All I needed to do then was to paint and base, and I was left with this. Here we have the completed Biovore, painted in a dark Hive Fleet Kraken scheme. Incidentally, I will be putting up a guide on how I painted this model very shortly, so if you're watching in the future, I'll include a link to that above and below. And so that concludes another conversion guide where I attempted to update an older, non-plastic miniature. Overall, I'm pretty happy with the result. I mainly used components from a single kit, which massively kept the price of this conversion down. A single Tyrant Guard kit would allow you to build 3 Biovores, making it considerably cheaper than buying 3 of the resin kits. It's also my first proper Tyranid conversion, so let me know what you think of the results in the comments below, and make sure you subscribe to see my future conversions. And so the final thing to say is a huge thank you to all of my supporters. Currently, my top Patreon supporters are Stuart Smith, Jeremy Kaup, Jake, and Daniel Dowling, so a big thank you to the guys. And if you also support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee, or you just use my affiliates links, then your help is what keeps this channel alive, and it's what allows me to build these slightly different kinds of conversions for you. If you would like to help me out, then you can check out my description for all of the relevant links. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.